Welcome, U.S. History 2 students. This is Miss Foley, and today we are going to be going over the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism. Those are big things that we're taking a look at today. So, in terms of what's going on, the first thing we're going to be talking about the Red Scare, examine why the Red Scare happened in the United States right after World War II. We're going to look at McCarthyism, what it means. We're going to analyze some political cartoons that looked at these topics, that looked at the Second Red Scare, that looked at McCarthyism. And then there's an assignment on Google Classroom that we are going to be taking a look at. We're going to look at the expectations with that so that you know what to do with that. Okay? So, first of all, what you need to know is, by the way, I have also attached Cornell notes to the our Google assignment page. It's completely optional. If you want like a hard copy of notes of everything that I'm going over, I have a copy of those. Feel free to print it out. That's just an option. It's not mandatory, but some people, like if it were me, I'd like something that is written down so you don't have to take any notes. Those Cornell notes are there for you. Okay, so just some background about the Red Scare. When we're talking about the Red Scare, red means Russia, means Soviet Union, it means communism. And after World War I, if you remember, the Soviet Union was on the United States team fighting for World War I. They were fighting with the British and the French against Germany during World War I, but Russia had to leave the war early. They actually individually settled peace during World War I with Germany, and they bowed out with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they had a revolution. And when they had that revolution, they turned from, kind of a regular democratic state to a communist state. Okay, so after World War I, the United States was afraid that, hey, if that could happen in Russia, where they had a civil war and turned communist, we're afraid low key that that could happen here. So when we talk about the first Red Scare, we're talking about right after World War I. This lesson, however, is the second Red Scare, which was definitely more intense, which was definitely bigger. This happened after World War II, and the reason why people were concerned, um, obviously, about communism and the fear of possibly the United States having a civil war and then becoming communist, is because not only do we not want to end up like the Soviet Union, aka Russia, like in the First World War, but they have become our rival. So, during the Cold War, that's the country that it's like, hey, choose a side. You're either on the Soviet Union side and communism, or you're on the United States side and democracy. So that's the question there. So the Second World War, you would see a sign like this. The most serious threat to our nation today is the Red Menace. It's the spread of communism. It's the spread of Soviet influence. And it's not only because we didn't want a civil war and communism, but because the Soviet Union was our rival and that they would be actively trying to take us down. Okay, so that's what Americans felt at the time. Um, President Truman's administration, he was definitely a little paranoid about communism. You would see civil wars in Europe and Asia after World War II. Different countries had, kind of civil wars. They had, rebellions because people after a war generally economically aren't doing so well. So the idea of communism is definitely an appealing one. Okay, the President Truman is also worried that communist spies, people that work for Soviet Union, may have infiltrated the United States State Department, the military, and maybe all institutions in American society. So this is going to be some paranoia that remember, Truman became president because FDR died in office, and then he was reelected in 1948. And so he's serving his term, and he's kind of looking at it like, okay, I dealt with dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. I dealt with getting out of World War II. Now I dealt with the Korea situation. Now I have to deal with this whole Red Scare situation, which is also obviously tied to Korea. In terms of security and civil rights, there were a lot of different security and civil rights issues. You had something called the Loyalty Review Board. So this was a organization established in the government that essentially says that you can take a look, kind of like a background of all different people and who work for the government, and see like where their loyalties are, kind of you know, look at their background and could they be communist? Could they be doing something against the United States? So, by the way, the whole overarching theme in this discussion is that people were so afraid of communism and the spread of communism that civil rights, sort of were in jeopardy. So we had the Loyalty Review Board, which investigates, the background of more than 3 million federal employees. And you kind of say to yourself, is that really necessary? You had a situation where the leader of the Communist Party was actually put in jail because they're advocating for, quote, the overthrow of the United States government. So when you advocate for changes that are so significant that you must be a menace to society. So this is actually happening in the United States, and it's kind of frightening to some people. We have that Supreme Court case that I listed under letter C. And essentially, this makes the Smith Act constitutional. The Smith Act of 1940 essentially said that you are not allowed to teach or you are not allowed to advocate the overthrow of the government by force or to belong to an organization with this objective. So you are not allowed to say, hey, the way this government is working right now really stinks, and we should change it. We should have a total revolution. If you're saying those words in 1950, you would be like, hey, this is America. I can say that, right? Wrong. We have Supreme Court cases. We have evidence that says that you're not allowed to say that. So this really challenges some of the ideas of civil rights that we are used to. We had the McCarthyism International Security Act, and again, this is just another law that made it illegal to support a totalitarian government, to not join communist organizations, and authorized that if you were caught doing any of these kinds of things, that they could set up a detention camp for you to go to. So this really doesn't sound like the United States, but it really did happen in the United States. And then, of course, probably the most popular is the House of Un-American Activities. When we talk about the House, we mean the House of Representatives. And this was a group within the House of Representatives, a part of Congress, that said, hey, we should, kind of investigate subversive activities. So what you need to know with this Un-American Activities, this was actually created in the 1930s, so before World War II. And originally when it was created, it was to find Nazis, fascists, and communists, but they kind of just used the same framework. And the government said, okay, we're going to use this really strictly after World War II to focus on communists. Okay, so during this time period, American liberties, civil rights are being threatened. Okay, that is something that you need to be aware of. In terms of, so there were a few cases of espionage. If you don't know what the word espionage means spying. okay, that you're going and that you're spying on another country. The United States sent spies to the Soviet Union to find their secrets. The Soviet Union sent spies to the United States. This is like the focal point of so many different movies and TV shows. So, one of the big ways that the United States and the Soviet Union, quote unquote, fought the World War was by, I mean, not the World War, the Cold War, is by sending spies to each other's countries and trying to figure out their secrets and trying to kind of like derail them. So, one of the most famous cases is the Alger Hiss case. And Alger Hiss was a very important member of the State Department. So he worked for the federal government, worked for the Secretary of State, and he assisted Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. Very, very important conference. So this guy has high security clearance. He's very influential, and he's really important to the United States. At the time, there was this guy named Richard Nixon. Yes, the same one that goes and becomes president about 2 decades later. Richard Nixon was a young conservative, and he wanted to investigate the case. So he was working for Congress at the time. And what he was able to figure out was that there was this other gentleman named Whittaker Chambers who was a communist, and he testified. So, when they were questioning him, he said, listen, that guy Alger Hiss? He gave me secret information. Well, just based on that evidence, just based on that testimony from that guy, Whittaker Chambers, Alger Hiss in 1950 was convicted of perjury and sent to prison. So perjury means that you lie under oath. So essentially, they brought him to trial and they said, were you a spy for the United States? Did you pass these secrets? And he said no, and they go, oh, well, we think you're lying, so we're going to throw you in jail for perjury. And I believe he was in jail for about 3 years. He lost his law license because of it. He was a lawyer as well, Alger Hiss. And what ended up happening is that Alger Hiss spent his entire life saying, it's not true. I was never a communist. I was never selling secrets to the Soviet Union. And many people believe his innocence. He wrote like several books, and he was even saying it. I think he died when he was like 92. I think it was like 2005 or 2007 when he actually passed away. And even on his deathbed, and poor guy's like ready to die, and he's like, I was not a communist. I had nothing to do with it. I love my country. So the result is that many Americans, at the time in 1950, many Americans were like, hey, if Alger Hiss could go down, if Alger Hiss was a communist, there must be many more. So it created to the hysteria in the short term. In the long term, when people really look at the case, they say to themselves, gee whiz, Alger Hiss maybe was innocent, and maybe this was a whole lot of nothing, right? So that's one of the big espionage cases. Another espionage case were the Rosenbergs. So a big thing that you need to ask yourself is, so the United States had that really secret Manhattan Project. The United States developed the atomic bomb in the middle of World War II. The United States used the atomic bomb to end World War II in the Pacific, to end it with Japan. And the United States was supposed to be the only country that had this special crazy atomic bomb. Well, a couple years after World War II, guess what other country got the atomic bomb? Yep, you guessed it, the Soviet Union. So the question becomes, how did the Soviet Union figure out how to do this? How did they get the technology? How did they know the secret? How did they figure it out? Somebody must have told them. Okay, there must be a spy. There must be someone selling information. That's the idea. So there's a couple of different avenues that we can trace. The first one is Klaus Fuchs, who was a British scientist who worked on the Manhattan bomb. He admitted giving some atomic bomb secrets to the Russians. The FBI, headed by J. Edgar Hoover at the time, traced another spy ring to a married couple called Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in New York. And essentially, they were told that they figured out how the atomic bomb was made, and they passed those secrets along to the Soviet Union. They had a controversial trial. In 1961, and they were found guilty of the crime and executed. That should say 1963, and executed in 1963. So they were found guilty. They said that they were innocent. At the time, many civil rights groups raised questions about, taking a look at this hysteria and whether it played a role in the conviction and the punishment of the Rosenbergs. So you have all these cases where it's like, maybe rushed to judgment. I'm not saying I think the Rosenbergs are innocent. I'm not sure. But it's one of those things that it happens so quickly. The hysteria kind of gets caught up. So those are things that we're looking at. At the same time, there is this guy named Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy is a Republican senator from Washington, because you have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate. And he did something pretty crazy that went totally viral. I know that going viral isn't a thing in 1950, but if there ever was such a thing as going viral, he would be the one that did it. What he did was, in 1950, he gave a speech to the Senate, and he said, by the way, there are 205 communists that are working for the State Department. He's like, I know there's 205 people, so a very specific number. This went crazy with media attention. So nobody knew who these people were. He wasn't saying the names. He just said that there's 205 people that are working for the government, that are communists, that are spies, that are working for the Soviet Union, and people went nuts. Okay, and a lot of his power came on because anything that he said, people just listened to him. Okay, and they just assumed that what he said was correct. So what ended up happening? So here, that's if you take a look at this picture right here on the left, this is McCarthy when he said, so he's like just a regular senator from Wisconsin, and he's like, listen, I have 205 names. I know who they are, and these people are putting America in jeopardy. So his tactics, the reason why he became so popular, the reason why he became such huge momentum, is because working class Americans are going to say that they actually liked that the wealthy people, that the privileged people, that the people in power were nervous. And if you were just a regular old, railroad worker or, like teacher or something like that, you probably didn't have anything to worry about. Like your name was probably not the one that was on Joseph McCarthy's list. The name that's on the list was some high-ranking government person, someone making a lot of money, that kind of thing. And then obviously, President Truman at the time, obviously, is a Democrat. So this is going to hurt the Democrats because they're in charge, they're in power. And this is going to help Eisenhower, who's going to be the next president elected in 1952, really become president. What ended up happening where Joseph McCarthy kind of crossed the line, if you will, is he accuses the State Department. The State Department is, people that work for the Secretary of State, people that work for the environment, like the EPA, people that work for the FDA, people that work, all those civilian programs. People didn't really care when you were attacking the State Department. But then in another speech, like a follow-up, Joseph McCarthy starts to attack the army. And if you know anything about Americans, hey, you can attack, the FDA or the EPA or a regular person that works in an office like a 9 to 5, but you can't attack the army. So when Joseph McCarthy got up and said, yeah, um, there's also people in the United States Army that are communists, that are working for the Soviet Union, that are trying to take the United States down. The minute he said army, Americans don't like when you mess with the military. Okay? And especially right after World War II. These people are heroes. They just went and saved France, saved Great Britain, saved the world. You don't throw those people under the bus. I mean, you shouldn't throw anybody under the bus, but you most certainly don't throw the army. So right away, in 1954, they had what was called a hearing, like a public. Okay, the army's here, McCarthy's here. McCarthy, what evidence do you have that people in the army are actually Russian spies, communists working for the Soviet Union? Okay, and what they did when they had this hearing, ladies and gentlemen, they put it on TV. You have to understand, in the 1950s, you don't put, like, TV was still so new that, mostly things got done on the radio, but not on TV. That's starting to become a new thing, okay? So it wasn't like everything. I mean, I know today everything's on TV, everything's on Twitter, everything's on Instagram, blah, blah. No. In the 1950s, that wasn't the norm. So they have these hearings, and when they did these hearings, McCarthy looked dumb. He looked like a bully who was just, yelling and making things up. He didn't have credible evidence, and millions of Americans looked at him and were like, "Oh man, you're kind of actually full of crap, aren't you?" So what ended up happening is that really after those hearings, people stopped taking McCarthy seriously, and he was considered disgraced. The problem is, you're talking about, he made that speech in 1950. These hearings were in 1954. So for 4 years, people's lives were ruined because of this Red Scare, because of this McCarthyism. So that's really the negative portion of it. Okay, and so that's that. So what ends up happening after this? So Truman, he wasn't running for re-election. He had already kind of done his 2 terms, because remember, he came in for FDR and then he was re-elected in 1948. But usually what ends up happening is the Democrat a lot of times tries to get another Democrat elected. So the election of 1952, if you can see this map here, was a guy named Adlai Stevenson and, going against Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Republican. The Democrat lost. Between the second Red Scare, the situation in Korea, the loss of diplomacy and good terms with China, and all the scandals surrounding Truman's advisors, Eisenhower won pretty handedly, as you can see in this map. So what ends up happening is that Truman decided to return to private life in Missouri, and Republicans blamed the mess on Washington on Truman. Okay, so now let's take a look at the political cartoons.